Good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. In a disturbing video released this month, officers with the Montgomery County Police Department in Maryland are seen handcuffing and berating a 5-year-old child who they detained in January of last year after he reportedly ran away from school. Now, the scene unfolds when police bring the child back to the station, and it's incredibly difficult to watch. The young boy cries hysterically, and one officer screams in his face. At multiple points in the video, the officers talk about why it's important to beat children, with one going as far as to encourage the boy's mother to hit her distraught and crying child. And the video has sparked outrage in Montgomery County, with some officials calling it yet another reminder that police are simply not equipped to deal with children and should therefore not be stationed in schools. Lawmakers have said that instead of paying armed officers to patrol schools, the county should be investing in things like restorative justice training, after-school engagement hubs, and providing social workers and school psychiatrists to every high school. And so for the latest on the debate to remove cops from schools in Montgomery County, Maryland, I am joined now by Council members Will Jawando and Nancy Navarro. Thank you so much both for joining us today. Councilmember Jawando, I'll start with you. Before we dig into the latest proposal on school resource officers, I want to close the loop on the story I led with, which involved this 5-year-old child. I know that you fought to get that video released. So can you give us some additional information on where that case stands now, and tell us how you think this episode fits into the broader conversation around police and schools?
Sure. Thank you for having us both. Thank you for having me. It's obviously a sickening, horrific video, that we've all had to witness and experience over the last several days. There's a lot of unanswered questions here. But the one thing that we do know is that this was completely inappropriate behavior on behalf of these police officers, on behalf of the administration who stood by of the school and watched. I just want to correct one thing you said. They actually took him back to the school, and that's where that occurred. And, everyone that was an adult in that situation failed this child. Every single adult, every system, the school system, the police department. He was distraught. I'm the father of a 2-year-old boy and 3 girls that are 7, 8, and 10. Cannot imagine that happening to my child, one of whom is autistic. And so we have a lot of questions. When we initially found out, only reason we found out that this had happened over a year ago was because there was a lawsuit filed. So that's a problem in and of itself. Communication to the council, to officials who are both Councilmember Navarro and I sit on the education committee. We should have heard about something of this severity because that's our job as policymakers. And then because of a state law, which will be changed hopefully in the next month or so, we don't even know what discipline was doled out. We know that a process happened, but that the officers are still working for the department. And because of their considered private records, personnel records, we're not allowed to know by state law what the discipline was. That's a huge problem for not only for us, but for the public. So we have questions about that. And then what did MCPS do? Did they reprimand the folks involved? Are they doing further training? Are they reviewing their policies? We have a whole range of questions there, obviously to address the needs of this student and his family, but to make sure as a policy level, it doesn't happen again. Because as I said, every system failed this young boy who was called a nasty little beast and yelled at in his face, and police officers threatening to beat him. It's just horrible behavior. And so we're going to dig into all of that so that we can prevent these types of things happening in the future. It underscores the point that police are not the proper tool to be interacting with our students, particularly in an enforcement and disciplinary capacity. And that's why we've been working, Councilmember Navarro and I and others, to try to remove police officers from schools, in the high schools, but also set up this broader systems of supports, mental health, social, emotional, so that they can get what they need. And this is just another example, unfortunately a tragic example, that we need to speed that work up.
And Councilmember Navarro, I want you to jump in here because to talk a little bit more about that plan. This is a plan to keep school resource officers, but to have them outside of school facilities and teams that would also include mental health professionals and other youth development staff. So can you give us an update on that proposal and where it currently stands?
Yeah, thank you, Alana, for the invitation. And it's great to be here with my colleague and friend, Councilmember Jawando, because this particular issue regarding the school resource officers, I think it's a very timely and important issue to revisit. I'm a firm believer that, especially right now, 2021, and especially who we are here in Montgomery County, over 73% of our students in Montgomery County Public Schools are students of color, and we have the 14th largest school system in the country. And therefore, it is imperative that we continually seek to evaluate and really update our service delivery models. It is really important to recognize that for our student population, having police officers just walking up and down the halls, it is not something that needs to occur. And it is very clear that we need to emphasize positive youth development, supports for mental health issues, and we don't have enough, even though the school system has about a $2.8 billion budget. So there is no doubt that this is a really auspicious moment to realign, to redistribute, to not just reimagine, but actually bring up to date these service delivery models. And so that is the work that is taking place right now. And I think it is really positive, and it will be positive for everyone. You know, there are parents who are really concerned about, well, how do I know my child is going to be safe in schools? And so the idea is not to say that if something tragic, you know, hopefully God willing would not happen, but if something like that occurred, of course it would be a response to the schools. But we need to also delineate what would be the reasons why principals or teachers can call police officers in the schools. We need to have clarity around that. We also need to make sure that our principals, administrators, our teachers understand how to access the myriad of resources that Montgomery County has to support students. That doesn't seem to be happening as much. And there's no doubt that we need to strengthen the kinds of supports within the schools as well. And so this work is quite comprehensive, and it's very structural in nature. But in my opinion, again, it brings us up to date. This incident that you described was heartbreaking on so many levels. It was so disappointing also because we have been engaged in a long, a lot of work around racial equity and social justice. 2019, we passed legislation during my presidency. I was the co-lead sponsor. All my colleagues, we worked together, including Councilmember Jawando. So we have been very proactive in the region, addressing a lot of these issues. And it speaks, it's a reminder of, why these issues are so structural in nature, and why systemic racism is something that you have got to work on every single day. But it was just so disturbing to realize that, there seemed to be this cavalier attitude to literally traumatizing a child during a situation like this. And that plays out in so many other policy areas, which is why it is the kind of work that you have to actively pursue on a daily basis.
So Councilmember, just to follow up, so you talked about how sort of a more holistic model could be much better in addressing student needs. So what's sort of the track of that plan right now? Is it in committee? Is it up for a vote? What's happening there?
So it's very interesting. So there are two pieces of legislation, and there's one particular one in which Councilmember Jawando has led on that I plan to offer an amendment in order to then truly, I guess, propose the actual model, right? So that it would take the police officers out of the school building. But then what happens? So then the idea is to have cluster models where you would have, police officers, but also mental health professionals that would be geographically assigned. And that is in case there is a need for some type of public safety response. But then also there would be a memorandum of understanding. So it would define what would be those reasons that you would call law enforcement in, and what would be the reasons that you would instead call the team that is comprised of mental health professionals, positive youth development folks. We have extraordinary programs like the School Outreach Network here in Montgomery County. So we would enhance that kind of response. But then within the school system, within the the school building, you would also have enhanced mental health professionals, positive youth development, those types of student-centered supports. You also would have an annual report that would delineate all the data that is needed to understand how the program is working. So there would have to be, again, with the memorandum of understanding, a sharing of data. That is going to be very important as well. In 2007, I actually led a proposal for something called the Kennedy Cluster Project, which brought together all the agencies in the county, looking at a particular area of the county where we were trying to address the issue of the academic achievement gap. And it created that kind of collaboration. Unfortunately, that framework was not funded, consequently, but it follows that model. In other words, it is a holistic approach, so that students, instead of the first reaction from administrators or from teachers, instead of the first reaction being, let me just call the school resource officer who is right here, the idea would be, what are the kinds of supports, programs, initiatives that the student can benefit from? Culturally and linguistically appropriate types of initiatives, programs, supports. This school system has grown exponentially, especially when it comes to our Black and Brown students. The service delivery models have not necessarily done that. The teacher, for example, the demographics, when you look at it, has not kept up the pace in terms of teachers and administrators reflecting the student population. And so the disconnect that exists that then leads to the disproportionality of suspensions and expulsions, it's something that is, again, very structural. And so this particular piece, I think, goes a long way. But there's no doubt that we also have to address a lot of other components that lead to this disproportionality in suspensions, in expulsions, and also in arrests.
Yeah.
What I've heard from both of you, and by the way, council member, thank you so much for clarifying that it happened at the school, the questioning, because I think that's, or the interrogation, I guess, because I think that's really important when realizing that this is a structural issue. It's sort of a culture, a punitive culture within schools that translates to the outside as well, and translates it into fueling the school to prison pipeline in Maryland. So Councilmember Jawando, I'll turn this to you. Do you think this proposal goes far enough in addressing the role that cops have played in this culture, that schools themselves have played in this culture, and also have played into fueling into that school to prison pipeline?
I appreciate the question, and I appreciate Councilmember Navarro discussing this proposal. It just shows you how complex and layered and entrenched this is. Maryland leads the nation in incarceration of young Black men. Leads the nation. Louisiana and Mississippi follow. In Montgomery County, 50% of the students arrested in 2018 in our school system by our SROs were Black. They represent 19% of the population. If you add our Latino population, you're over 75% of the students arrested in schools are Black or Latino. You look at, and that mirrors disproportionality in the community. And so I said, you can't address one without the other. Over half of our juveniles arrested under 18 in the community outside of school are Black. And we have deep disparities, and a lot of them are low-level offenses. I've dug into the offenses. It's marijuana possession, disorderly conduct. You look at what some of these things that people are being arrested for, where we know, for example, drug usage is done similarly, if not more, in our white community, but we see who's disproportionately bearing the brunt of it. And you go down to suspensions and expulsions, referrals to the principal, you go down to every level. And it adds up to this. You see an example of it with this poor little boy who everyone there, no one felt, you look at this video, no one felt any sympathy for him. No one tried to console him. No one saw him as a child. And he was treated, just horribly. And I think that's not just one situation. You can't get the data I just quoted and then look at this situation and say that we don't have a structural issue. And this is going on around the country. I think we do a lot of great things in Montgomery County, but this is hard work. And so to your point of, does it go far enough? I think we have to continue to address all aspects of this. When we introduced the bill that I led to remove school resource officers, we also introduced 3 special appropriations, which I think you mentioned in the lead-in, one of which Councilmember Navarro and I passed through the Education Committee, and now the whole council has passed, to train over 1,400 of our middle school staff, teachers, educators, and support staff in restorative justice training, which is a proven strategy that our school system had started through a grant from the Casey Foundation, but that was expiring. That helps make everyone whole in the situation and is proven to reduce disparate discipline and arrest. And so that's something we have to double down on. Certainly everyone in that room with this young boy, I can't imagine they had received those training. It hasn't got as deep at the elementary level yet. And so it's an example of the many things, including social workers, school psychiatrists, psychologists. We have an SRO in every high school. We don't have a school psychologist in every high school. You can't have that. And then how do we interact? When are police called? I think it's important to note too that in this situation, these officers were not SROs because we don't have them in the elementary school, but they were called to the school and then allowed in violation of MCPS policy. And you saw what occurred afterwards. So we have to strengthen and look at those policies and review them. And do we need to have changes in different laws? And what's the training that every officer receives, regardless of whether they're encountering our students in a school building or out? And so it's a systemic thing that's connected all over, and certainly connected to the school to prison pipeline. And we just have to continue to close all those holes in that pipeline and try to support our students with everything that they need, some of which Councilmember Navarro discussed just a minute ago.
What is the sort of response that you've been getting to these proposals? Who's opposing, who's in favor, and how are people explaining their opposition? Councilmember Navarro, I'll kick this one to you.
I think it's mixed. There's no doubt that there are, some people who believe that we are undermining safety in the schools. There are a lot of other people who understand that, again, this is a very, important component of how we begin to disrupt the school to system, the school to prison pipeline. There are others who believe that, we should just eliminate a police department, period. I mean, there's definitely a range. I do believe that working on a comprehensive model and having a comprehensive model, that framework I think will be important, because it then highlights and demonstrates that there are ways to really shift the ultimate goals. In conversations and meetings with the school system leadership, the president of the school board, when I talked about what are the pieces that we are working on, at one point said, "Oh, I see what you mean. This really does address all of the components that we have all been so concerned about." And so I think it's a start. As Councilmember Joanna was saying, this work, it's not a panacea that if you address one particular issue, all of a sudden the next day you wake up and disproportionality is gone. But there are particular tools, I would say, or particular interventions like this one that starts that process, because at the end of the day, it's about culture change. It is about embedding in these very large structures. As I said, this is the 14th largest school system in the nation. So you have to embed in the structure particular models that will then shift the culture. That is not work that happens overnight, but you have to couple with this, for example, initiatives to diversify the staffing in the school system. You have to include in there, embed particular kinds of mandatory training, like the restorative justice work. You have to enhance those types of programs that are in the schools. One of the things that I oftentimes talk about is that we do have initiatives and we have programs, but we don't scale them up. So you might have a restorative justice training. There's one particular one called La Cultura Cura, which is about culture and how culture and identity is so important, but then it's never scaled up. And so, I think that we have to look at all of those different pieces in order to really begin to see an impact. If not, it would look great that, you have particular interventions, but if they're not really serving a proportional amount of students and families, then you don't get to that point. So I think we're on the right track. There is no doubt. I feel pretty good about that, but there's definitely a lot more work that will have to happen to continue to enhance and scale up these kinds of intervention and initiatives. I will say one other thing, when we start talking about what kind of mental health professionals we want there. We've had a lot of conversations about how difficult it is to find, licensed social workers or psychologists who are also culturally and linguistically proficient. And so we need to also figure out, how do you perhaps create a pipeline, right? So that you may not have necessarily in every school, a complement of licensed folks, but maybe you have people who are being trained and under one licensed person to then grow your own, Black, Latino, licensed social workers, et cetera, so that they can best serve the population of students, which again are about 73% students of color.
What about police unions? How have they been responding to this?
Well, I don't know who you were directing that to. I can chime in first if you want.
Yes, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll say one of the things the police union put out a statement in regards to this, very horrific event with this young man, this young boy, this 5-year-old, saying that these police officers were not trained to deal with this type of situation. And I say I absolutely agree. That was evident from the video, but they stopped there, and that's really all they said. And I think they were trying to point to the point that a school resource officer would have been better trained to deal with these students. But as I mentioned to you, police are called, we have school resource officers currently, but they will no longer be there. So I want to give a shout out to that. The advocates, the many people that rallied, school resource officers will not be there next year. And now we're building the systems that can support students. So we have made some progress. And data shows when you remove school resource officers from the building, that proximity matters. Arrests and disproportionality do go down. It's not alone enough, but it is an important step. But I think the point here is that all of our officers, whether that young man was 5 years old or 50, no one should have been talked to that way. Should have a baseline of humanity and training, and cultural proficiency and competency, and to deal with our diverse population. Again, whether it's happening in the school building or at home or on the way home, we have disproportionality in our criminal justice system across the board. And so we have to address that. So it's not good enough to say that these officers didn't get the 40 hours of SRO training. And I often say also, if you're a school psychologist, you go to school for 4 to 7 years, 40 hours for an SRO. You're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Their job is not to be involved in discipline and in that type of enforcement capacity in a school building, which is supposed to be a safe place. And so I think on this issue, on many issues, the police union has been an impediment. I'd like to work with them. One of the things I've fought for is to increase pay of our officers. Just like with teachers, if you want to hold people to high standards, and that's a very important job, public safety, we should pay people appropriately. But with that becomes a lot of accountability and a lot of responsibility and high standards. And so I hope there'll be a partner going forward. But from what I've seen, it's been more of an impediment relationship up until this point, unfortunately.
It's always interesting to me when I hear officers say, we aren't trained to do this. Or, these officers weren't trained to do this, because I think that's a point where actually everybody can agree. Like every police officer is going to say, I'm not a social worker, because they're not, which sort of, to me, illustrates the need to not have police officers dealing with these sorts of situations, just like you were saying. Or
people who are dealing with mental health crises, or people experiencing homelessness, or, go down the list. And we're also working on those issues as well.
Precisely. All of the other things that police officers shouldn't be dealing with. We also have worked on community policing specifically, which is also really important. So issues of like pay, but also police officers that come from our county, that know the communities. I mean, that is also really important piece that we are addressing, because it does go back to this notion of, understanding your role as a public safety officer.
So I want to open this last one up for discussion. When we talk about reimagining this world, and you've both sort of gotten into a little bit of this with your proposal, how do you imagine sort of the perfect world when it comes to helping children in schools look like? What would that look like? A police-free school? How would it shift out in practice? How would it play out in practice? And how would it improve the safety of students who are in school?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Do you want? I can
Well,
start.
I'll say that it really starts in early care and education. Also, I think that is really important. I think we need to invest, and we're doing that because one of the things that has been critical is to make sure that our students, when they enter kindergarten, that everybody has had access to opportunities and is able to, go in and be in a level playing field. But then also, when the child enters that school, they should be expected to learn. Many times, the expectation is not necessarily there, and so this issue of access to opportunity is really important. Access to supports, such as social workers, make sure that we have complements of counselors, make sure that there are teams that have pupil personnel workers, parent community coordinators, as well as psychologists. They're ready to support. But the issue of being engaged is really important. That also takes place outside of the school. So, the concept of community school has always been one that I know I very much support, and ensuring that every corner of our county has also access, to jobs, to healthcare, to, affordable and dignified housing. All of those issues come together. So I think it is important to not just single out one particular component, because students will be in the schools during the day, but then they go out into the community. It is really about this notion. People always talk about wraparound services, but it is about addressing all of these different disparities that then also show up in the school system altogether. And that is why having, laws like racial equity and social justice, where you have to analyze every single legislative proposal or budgetary decision through the lens of racial equity and social justice, is really important, because that is how you begin to dismantle the structural decisions that have led to all of these disparities. So again, it's not a simple fix, but a very necessary one. And I'm really hopeful that some of the work that we have begun here and some of the things that we have strengthened begin to provide and show some positive results.
Yeah. And I would just add, I think, that I agree with everything Councilman Navarro said. We want a system. A school is supposed to be a place of learning, of safety, of confidence building. So we want all of our students to walk in the building and to not be confronted with one of the good quotes I used from President Bush, one of his speechwriters, the soft bigotry of low expectations that still happens all too often for our students of color and our students with disabilities. So we want everyone to be challenged, to be loved, to be seen as a child. I think in this case, this is an example where a child was not seen as a child. And there's data to suggest from the American Psychological Association that Black and brown children are seen as more dangerous and older than they actually are. And that goes back to the training and to the supports and who we hire, all those things. So you have a building that's supportive. You have staff that reflects the diversity of the community. You have police that are not there in an enforcement capacity. I think another thing is important to say, and I'm very careful to say that, because I do think the goal of good community, public safety, police relations is a strong and important goal. It's just not supposed to be happening when police are roaming up and down hallways. If we want to have programmatic functions, basketball after school, assemblies where students can ask questions, where you remove some of that threat of enforcement, those are positive outcomes I think we do have. Career day, they happen and they can continue to happen. It's just with that enforcement capacity. So we want schools that are supportive of every student and that really push them to learn. And then you have these wraparound services. We funded the Harlem Children's Zone when I worked in the Obama administration, and then tried to model this Promise Neighborhoods program, which was really a birth to career program where you followed the mothers from pregnancy and you followed the kids all the way along, and you supported the families. After school programs, we know that's critically important, those 3 to 7 hours for kids. So every school that needs it would have access to that. And those are the types of systems we're trying to build. But again, a lot of pieces have already been laid. We just need to ramp up, get the training right, and make the investments, because it's going to cost money. That's the other thing. And we're going through the budget now. We're going to have to make some decisions about, are we really going to do this in an equitable way? And I think I know for these two council members, I think the answer is yes. And I think for most of our council, the answer is yes, if not all. And we got to make those decisions.
Well, hopefully that is a world that we will be able to see soon. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Alana. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So I don't recommend that video for the video of this arrest for anyone who is faint of heart, because again, it is difficult to watch. But it also really highlights the fact that children, and particularly children of color in this country, have often been terrorized by the institutions that are supposed to protect them. You know, something I keep thinking is, why is it that a child who is skipping school isn't addressed by a team of social workers saying, hey, why are you running from this place that is supposed to keep you safe? Why is it that the response is instead for police officers to berate this child, to terrorize this child, to say more than once that this child should be beaten? When you hear this, it tells you everything you need to know about the way that police departments have viewed children, and specifically how police departments have viewed Black children in the history of this country. And so let's imagine what could have happened and sort of the world that the council members were describing if the child was met with a proportionate response. Maybe someone would have approached that child. Maybe there was something going on with him. Maybe there was some sort of issue at school. Maybe there was a disability. We don't know what could have caused this child to run away from his school. But what we do know is this. Whatever barrier that he was facing, this police interaction could only have made it worse. The trauma of having a police officer berating you, screaming in your face when you're crying, is not going to help him and prevent him from running away from school again. And so we can only hope that a better world is on the horizon, one where we see kids as kids, where we treat children as children, one where they are not berated for simply existing. So as we hope for that world, please continue to follow us here on the Appeal Live as we track this issue. You can continue to do that on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.